So I'm happy to introduce our first presenter who's joining us today from Ringling College of Art and Design in Sarasota. Kelly is their instructional design librarian at Ringling College. And she's going to present on zines and zine history. So let me pull up your presentation and then I will pass it over. Okay, thank you, Kelly.
So hi everybody. Thank you, Caitlin. I really appreciate being included in this talk today. Um, I'm gonna talk about a zine history. I wanted to specify a zine history because I am not a historian, and this is what I've gathered from my research on zine history, and it's also very centered around America and the UK. So I'll go into the history and I'll also briefly introduce my history with zines. So, like Caitlin said, I am an instructional design librarian at Ringling College. I've been a professional librarian for 3 years since I got my master's in library science. However, I've had a history with zines for about 10 years and also with libraries for about 10 years now. So my undergraduate school, SUNY New Paltz, actually hired me as a zine library intern, and I helped create a zine library at SUNY New Paltz. And for my master's, for my honors thesis for my undergraduate degree, I actually made a 23-minute long documentary where I interviewed key players in the New Paltz zine community. Um, Gratefully for me, you can't view this unless you are a SUNY New Paltz student or employee, but you can briefly read. I know the text is small on the slide there. But you can briefly read that I did create a documentary film, and I even made a metazine to go along with that film. It was called Above Ground and the Underground Collide, the Convergence of Zine Culture in the Academic Setting. And I also got to create zines while I was a student, and I was able to present on the outreach that we did with zines and zine instruction when I was a student at different library conferences, and that actually spearheaded my career into becoming a librarian. And now I've been both a public librarian and an academic librarian. I got my first library job down in Venice, Florida, at the Jacaranda Public Library, and I have photos on the screen of an example of a zine that a child made, which I thought was very wholesome. And it was during the pandemic, so it was about just promoting happiness and peace. And then on the right-hand side, I have a program that I put on when I was a librarian at New College. So that was my first academic librarian job. And I brought a zinester, Osa Ato, to talk about Shotgun Seamstress, which was her zine. And I'll talk briefly about that a little bit later on in my presentation. So I know that most of us here already know what zines are, so I'm not going to go super into what a zine is, but I just wanted to be aware that zines are usually self-published, and I use the word typically here. So zines, a lot of people like attribute them with counterculture, but sometimes they're just about things that you love. Sometimes they're very personal stories. Sometimes they are political. Sometimes they're critical, etc. They really can be anything you'd like them to be, but typically they're low budget and DIY. Um, and there's a lot of different types of zines. Pictured here, I have different types of folds, but they come in all shapes and sizes. And if you're here in person today, I did bring an array of my personal collection of zines, so you're more than welcome to check those out when we have time at the end. And I also brought a book on the history of fanzines, which has a lot of really great high resolution photos of zines in it. So where did zines start? That's why we're here today. We're talking about the history of zines. And a lot of people, especially in the art realm, I work at Ringling College of Design, talk about zines and the Dada movement. So it was an art movement that kind of emerged and it combined futurism, cubism, expressionism, etc. And the University of Iowa actually has a whole digital library where you could look at that. But that was around the 1920s. However, I put together a timeline that people sometimes argue it goes back even further when the Gutenberg press was invented in the 1400s. And then people just started making self-publications. Common Sense by Thomas Paine is largely attributed to one of the first zines, even though maybe it's considered a pamphlet by some people. Women's suffrage zines exist. William Blake made Songs of Innocence. And, the Communist Manifesto, which I don't have pictured here, by Karl Marx. Little magazines were different than zines, but they were usually literary. And then the Comet was considered the first actual fanzine. However, the term fanzine actually came right after the comic, so it was a science fiction fan mag. And then the term fanzine was actually coined right after that, a few years later. The Xerox copier was born, and then the commercial photocopier was introduced. So that's why there was such a boom later on of zines being mass produced. And I do have a brief timeline of zines, and I can't exactly talk too long about every single decade of the past 100 years, but I'm going to briefly highlight some of my favorite. But really, it started out with science fiction fanzines, went into comic fanzines, horror zines, punk fanzines. And then we got the Riot Girl movement, and then we got a lot of intersectional zines to kind of talk back to the white feminist movement. And then we had a lot of social justice zines and digital zines going into the 2010s. And then we saw a lot of pandemic zines, and again with the political zines as a response to current events happening. Um, and something that I found very funny when I was doing my research on the history of zines is that Frederick Werdum of the Comics Code Authority notoriety actually wrote positively about fanzines. He was a science fiction fanzine fan. And he said that they were a unique, unmanaged type of publication free from outside interference, without control or manipulation from above, without censorship, visible or invisible. So I think that that's just hilarious that someone that started comic censorship was actually pro-zine. Um, so going back to how I mentioned the term fanzine was actually introduced in 1940s by the author of Detours, and you could see it pictured on the left-hand side here. In 1949, the term was actually added to the Oxford English Dictionary. And around 1970s, it was then shortened to just zine by a lot of authors. Um, so even Frederick Wertham himself acknowledged that there's a lot of fluidity in the boundaries of these publications, which we still see today. Another really popular author that got his start with zines is Ray Bradbury, who actually created Futura Fantasia in 1938 when he was only 18 years old, and there were only 4 issues of this, and then he went on to be a world famous author, as we know. And this is actually what I found from Mimi's guide that I will bring up the reference to in a second. But one of the first queer lesbian magazines in the United States was actually written under the pen name Lisa Ben. Sounds like lesbian. And here's a photo of her in 1945 reading Weird Tales. So what was really interesting about her is that she moved to LA, was super interested in the sci-fi fanzine realm, got a job where she was told to just sit around and look pretty. So she worked on creating her own zine until she unfortunately got let go just because of, I think, staff turnover at her job. But she then went on to contribute to zines after that. So she really started a movement. And it's funny because it wasn't very appealing to look at, but again, it's still one of the first queer zines out there. Um, and then I also wanted to bring up the St. Pete College LibGuide that exists. It's actually linked here, and if you want to share my slide after this, with all of the links are live links that I have with my sources. Um, so in the 80s, we saw a giant boom of zine making because of the photocopiers being popularized by Kinko's, and just easy access for people. So we saw a lot of response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, telling stories that weren't being told in primary news media outlets. Um, and I actually did a whole presentation at Ringling on using zines as primary sources. So zines are great in this capacity where you can talk about someone's firsthand account of the epidemic. Another interesting highlight of the 80s was Subterranean Pop started off as a zine that was dedicated to emerging indie rock bands and then later led to Sub Pop Records, which found Nirvana and Sonic Youth and more. So Bruce Pavitt was actually the one that started Sub Pop Records. And here are some covers on the right-hand side that were illustrated by Charles Burns, who's one of my favorite comic artists, actually. He wrote Black Hole. Um, and another really popular zine in the history of zines is Maximum Rock and Roll for being one of the most popular, important zines in the punk scene. So in 1977, they started a radio show. They got really popular. And then in 1982, they decided to print a zine and they went on to have more than 400 copies. And unfortunately stopped physically printing their materials in 2019. However, they do continue to have an online presence. There were a lot of zines about zines, so meta zines that actually allowed readers to discover zines, because how else would you discover zines if they're being published all over the world? You have to exchange them with people physically, you have to mail them. So you could subscribe to Fact Sheet 5, for example, which was one of the first popular zines about zines. And by issue 44 of Fact Sheet 5 in the summer of 1991, over 10,000 copies were being distributed across the country, which is really impressive for something that we consider like a niche interest, actually just started to blow up in the late 80s and early 90s. And then in the mid 90s, Broken Pencil started, and unfortunately, Broken Pencil just stopped last year, but it had a good run. And you can still look at their online archive of zine reviews. Um, and I wanted to mention the Riot Girl movement too in the 90s. But when I was doing my research on the history of zines, I also discovered Slant, which was an anarchist feminist zine from 1993 that was actually a response to Maximum Rock and Roll, the zine that I mentioned earlier, um, that wrote pretty disgusting and terrible things about Asian Americans in the punk scene. So they were like, hey, we're gonna reclaim this, we're gonna make our own zine about it. And I wanted to highlight this because a lot of the Riot Girl movement was actually like very like white girl power. But there were a lot of other folks publishing zines that were people of color. And I wanted to particularly bring up Shotgun Seamstress again. So Osa actually lives in Sarasota, and in 2022, a whole book of a collection of her zines was published. I actually meant to bring it today, but it is in the St. Pete College library system. I already looked it up, so you can check it out, which is great. So now she focuses on ceramic arts, which is really cool too. But back in the day in 2006, she started her own zine just about Black kids in the punk scene having fun. And I've talked to her and I got to have a workshop with her at New College when I work there. And she's a very sweet woman. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And she was even interviewed in The Guardian. Um, which leads me to my next point. So zines really did explode in popularity. That's why Caitlin's here doing what she does and having our Zine Fest next weekend here. Not next weekend, I guess the 15th. The 15th, everyone will be there. It'll be poppin' just like it was the first year last year. Very crowded. Things will sell out. Um, by the 90s, the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Time, Newsweek were actually reporting on popular zines, and then with the internet coming out, um, people were publishing their zines online, and I don't go in depth on a lot of online magazines and zines. I feel like I don't mind reading them online. I actually do like reading scanned PDFs, but you lose that ephemeral quality to a printed zine where, zines are mass produced, but they're also a rarity sometimes because if you have one out of a 200 print run, it's special. And now I brought mine here to share with you all today, and you can browse them and you can see stuff that other people might not ever get to see. But now you can find scanned PDFs online. They're archived in a lot of libraries, and I definitely, as a librarian, recommend them for primary uh sources. And zines have even been in a lot of popular culture references. Rocket Power, popular Nickelodeon kids show. Reggie had a zine about skateboarding, being, the girl in her group of friends. Um, Not saying I'm a fan of Kanye West, but he had this tweet in 2016 helping people pronounce zine because a lot of people pronounce it wrong. And there was a film directed by Amy Poehler based on a book called Moxie, in which the main character makes a like Riot Girl inspired zine. And most recently, in 2023, the American Girl doll was introduced. Her name is Nikki, and she's from the 90s, and she makes zines, and we can briefly look at her zine here. This is actually a zine, I think, inspired by the American Girl doll. But you get the gist. How do I get back to my slide? There we go. All right. So the toucan says that you can make a zine. I did not mean to hit share. I meant to hit present. There we go. So everyone can make zines, and they can really range in all different topics. But really the most important thing about them is that they are self-published and that they usually emphasize your voice and not somebody else's voice. And you can find them in the library. This is just a brief glimpse of some of our collections. At Ringling College, we have most of our zines in special collections, so you can view them by appointment only, but we might change that so that they're more browsable in the future. Um, and I didn't mean to click on that link. Let me go back to my slideshow. Oop, nope. All right. And I just wanted to briefly mention I made a zine guide myself when I worked at New College, and I actually transferred it over to Ringling College because now I can still edit the Ringling College one. Since I no longer work at New College, I don't control this guide being updated. But I wanted to mention that I was actually interviewed by the New College Catalyst about zines and their zine scene there. And now I have this guide and I'll click on it. So it is live, where I list how to get started with zines. I have this category where I list a lot of different Florida zine libraries, and I even tried to chart a map of different Zine Fest and zine library collections, and it's actually organized by color. So that's a Zine Fest if it's blue, and then I think the purple was a zine collection. Um, and then I even have resources for people that want to teach with zines, like I try to do with my own work because I teach information literacy and I talk about teaching authority and giving students power to create their own voices and using zines as primary sources. All right. Does anyone have any questions? Thanks for listening. Yeah.
I have a question about, I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about how you teach zines in your information literacy instructions.
Yeah, so luckily I do work at an art and design institution, and most recently, for example, I've been working with photography thesis students that are doing contemporary research. So for that, they've been looking at photo zines in some of our special collections that I've directed them to. Um, I know that there's another class that was actually on food history. Um, and I made a LibGuide based on food history, and I included zines. So sometimes I just include zines in um at libraries we have things called LibGuides, so they're like research guides, and we can list books and movies and other forms of media that people can either check out or view at the library. So I include it in my list.
Do you feel like students are kind of interested in that? Access to those?
I think they're definitely interested. Unfortunately, at our institution, we have the barrier of that they have to make an appointment to view our zine collection. So we are looking to remedy that in the future so that it's more browsable, so that they're not limited by someone's schedule with viewing them. Yeah, feel free to browse my zines. I don't know how we're doing on time, but
Chat, we would love your library guide. I think
oh yeah, I could probably pop the link in the chat. Uh, Let me see. Yeah, so Ringling Zine Guide, the URL is ringling.libguides.com/zines, but I will pop it in the Zoom chat. Sorry, I went by too fast. I am from New York, and sometimes I talk very fast.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming. Yeah.
Check out the Zine.
All right.
Right. So for our folks online, I'm going to pause our recording, and our next presentation will start at 1:45. So feel free to hang out or leave and pop back in.